St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in North America, founded in 1565, 42 years before Jamestown, 55 years before the Pilgrims reached Plymouth Rock. Every year, hundreds of thousands of tourists walk through the gates of a 15-acre park here, past peacocks and archaeological exhibits, past cannons and colonial artifacts, to reach a small well. They wait in line. They're handed a paper cup. They drink. The water tastes of sulfur, mineral-rich, sharp on the tongue. Some visitors wince. Others smile hopefully, as if something ancient has just passed through them. Parents hold up children. Grandparents close their eyes and wish. They have come to drink from the fountain of youth. The well was dug in 1875. Two labourers named Philip Gomez and Philip Cowpo, sank it for a British horticulturist who wanted water for his property. The woman who turned that well into a tourist attraction arrived in 1904, fresh from the Klondike Gold Rush, with cash, ambition, and a diamond embedded in her front tooth. And the Spanish explorer whose name is attached to this place, Juan Ponce de León, the man who discovered Florida while searching for the Fountain of Youth, never wrote a single word in any letter, in any contract, in any surviving document about searching for any fountain. The Fountain of Youth, as history knows it, is built on a lie. But here's what makes it remarkable. The lie is older than America, older than the Spanish Empire, older than Christianity itself. For 2,500 years, humans have told stories about magical water that restores youth. The locations change, the seekers change, the empires that chase it rise and fall. But the story persists in ancient Greek histories, in Islamic poetry, in medieval forgeries, in Spanish colonial archives, in Florida tourist traps. That persistence is the real mystery. Before we go further, I want to be clear about what this is and what it isn't. This isn't a story about magic water. The Fountain of Youth doesn't exist, has never existed, and cannot exist. The chemistry is impossible. The biology is fantasy. No serious person has believed otherwise for centuries. What follows instead is a history, traced through primary sources, academic research, and archaeological evidence, of how one of humanity's most enduring myths came to be. We'll begin in the 5th century BC, with a Greek historian writing about a violet-scented spring in Africa. We'll trace the myth through the legends of Alexander the Great, through medieval forgeries that fooled empires, through Caribbean whispers that Spanish conquistadors misunderstood. We'll examine exactly how Ponce de León's reputation was destroyed by a court chronicler with a political grudge, and how that smear campaign, intended as an insult, became accepted history. We'll meet Diamond Lil, the extraordinary con artist who monetized the whole thing. And we'll ask the question that matters most. Why do we keep telling this story? Why, across every culture and every century, do humans dream of water that conquers death? The documents are real. The archaeology is ongoing. The legend itself has been examined by historians at institutions from the University of South Florida to the Smithsonian. This is the story of the Fountain of Youth and the very human fears and hopes that created it. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. The oldest surviving written account of youth restoring water comes from a man called the Father of History, and also, by some of his critics, the Father of Lies. Herodotus of Halicarnassus was born around 484 BC in what is now the southwestern coast of Turkey. He lived through one of the most consequential periods in Western history, the clash between the Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, and the fractious Greek city-states that would ultimately defeat it. He traveled widely throughout the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, documenting the peoples, customs, and wars of his age. He visited Egypt, sailed to the Black Sea, explored Babylon. He gathered stories from merchants, priests, soldiers, and anyone else who would talk to him. His great work, The Histories, is our primary source for the Greco-Persian wars that shaped the classical world. It's also filled with digressions, lengthy descriptions of foreign lands and peoples that go far beyond the military narrative. Herodotus was as much an ethnographer as a war correspondent, and like any ethnographer, he recorded what he heard without always endorsing it. "My duty is to report what I am told," he wrote, "but I am not obliged to believe it all." This is important to remember. When Herodotus describes flying snakes or gold-digging ants, he's not necessarily claiming these things are true. He's documenting what people told him. He's preserving the stories of his era, with all their exaggerations and confusions. Among the stories he preserved was an account of the Macrobians. The Macrobians, the name means long-lived ones, were a people said to dwell somewhere at the southern edge of the known world. The Greeks had only the vaguest conception of sub-Saharan Africa. They knew Egypt, they knew the North African coast, but the interior of the continent was mostly mystery. Ancient sources disagree on exactly where the Macrobians lived. Some modern scholars place them in what is now Ethiopia. The region had contact with Egypt and Arabia and could have filtered stories northward. Others suggest Somalia, which had ancient trading connections with the Mediterranean world. Still others argue they lived in Western Africa, near where the Atlantic meets the Sahara, at what Greeks considered the literal edge of the earth. What Herodotus tells us is that the Persian king Cambyses II, around 525 BC, sent spies to learn about these mysterious people before launching a military expedition against them. Cambyses had already conquered Egypt, adding one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations to the Persian Empire. Now, he turned his attention southward, but before committing his armies, he wanted intelligence. The spies Cambyses sent were ichthyophagoi, fish-eaters, a people from the Red Sea coast who spoke languages that might allow communication with southern peoples. They traveled to the Macrobian king bearing gifts: a purple robe dyed with Tyrian murex, a gold necklace, a container of precious perfume and wine. The king was not impressed. According to Herodotus, the Macrobian king saw through the diplomatic pretense immediately. "The Persians do not come to me in friendship," he reportedly said. He dismissed the purple dye as trickery. The Persians had simply colored the robe, not made it from something of true value. The gold necklace he called worthless decoration, chains for prisoners rather than ornaments for free men. The perfume he mocked for trying to make the body smell like something other than what it was. But the wine intrigued him. He asked about it, and when told it was made from grapes, he remarked that it must be why Persians died so young. They poisoned themselves with this drink. The spies, astonished by his vigor and confidence, asked the question that had brought them: "How long do your people live?" Most Macrobians, the king told them, lived to be 120 years old. Some lived even longer. When the Persians expressed disbelief, the king led them to a spring. Here is how Herodotus describes what they found. When they had washed in it, they found their flesh all glossy and sleek, as if they had bathed in oil, and a scent came from the spring like that of violets. The water was so weak, the spies said, that nothing would float in it, neither wood nor any lighter substance, but everything sank to the bottom. If the water truly is what they claim, it is because of it that the people are long-lived, using it for everything. This is our first fountain of youth. Now, what do we make of this? Herodotus wasn't claiming the water granted immortality. He wasn't even claiming it reversed aging. He was documenting a foreign culture's explanation for their own longevity, a spring with unusual properties that the Macrobians believed contributed to their health. Notice that Herodotus qualifies his statement. If the water truly is what they claim. He's reporting, not endorsing. He's a journalist, not a believer. The weakness of the water, the fact that nothing could float on it, suggests unusually high mineral density. Such springs exist throughout Africa and the Middle East. The Dead Sea, for example, is so mineral dense that humans float on it rather than sink. But a spring at the other extreme, where even wood sinks, would indicate extremely low surface tension combined with unique dissolved compounds. The violet scent could indicate certain sulfur compounds or organic matter. Mineral springs often have distinctive odors, some pleasant, some much less so. The glossy skin effect might result from mineral oils or natural petroleum deposits, which occur in various African locations. In other words, Herodotus may have been describing a real place, a hot spring perhaps, or a mineral pool that the Macrobians valued for its perceived health benefits. Modern researchers have even suggested that the Macrobians' reported longevity might have had real explanations. Intermittent fasting, common among African pastoral peoples, high-altitude living conditions, diets rich in certain nutrients. The Rift Valley of Ethiopia, one candidate for Macrobian territory, contains volcanic hot springs, high elevations, and populations that historically practiced calorie restriction. These aren't magical explanations. They're the kind of lifestyle factors that modern longevity research takes seriously. But none of that mattered to the legend that would grow from Herodotus's account. What mattered was the template, a spring located at the edge of the known world, associated with unusually long-lived people, promising something miraculous to those who found it. After hearing these reports, Cambyses launched his invasion. It went catastrophically wrong. The Persian army marched into the Sahara Desert without adequate supplies. The logistics that had carried them across Mesopotamia and through Egypt failed utterly in the African interior. According to Herodotus, they ran out of food entirely. The soldiers began eating pack animals, then grass and leaves, then leather from their equipment, then each other. They drew lots among themselves, Herodotus wrote, and every 10th man was chosen to be eaten. Cambyses, witnessing his army devour itself, finally abandoned the expedition. He turned back, his forces decimated, his dreams of southern conquest shattered. The Macrobians were never conquered. Their mysterious spring was never verified. The fountain remained unreached. Cambyses himself would die shortly afterward, possibly by suicide, possibly from an infected wound, possibly from a mental breakdown brought on by his African disasters. His empire passed to Darius I, who would face the Greeks at Marathon. This established a pattern that would repeat for the next 2.5 millennia. The fountain of youth, in every version of the story, exists at the edge of the known world. It's associated with people who live exceptionally long lives. It promises something miraculous, and it remains forever out of reach. The seekers who chase it come to ruin. The water stays hidden. The story endures. Herodotus planted the seed, but it was another conqueror, the most famous in history, whose legend would carry it forward across centuries and civilizations. Alexander III of Macedon died in Babylon on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. To call his career extraordinary understates it completely. At 20, he inherited a kingdom the size of a small American state. By 25, he ruled more territory than any human being had before, from Greece to Egypt to Persia to the edges of India. He had never lost a battle. He had defeated the largest empire in the ancient world with an army that never exceeded 50,000 men. At 32, he was dead. Fever, perhaps typhoid, perhaps poisoning, perhaps both, took him in less than 2 weeks. His generals asked who should inherit his empire. The strongest, he reportedly said, or perhaps the best. The words were ambiguous. He may have been too delirious to speak at all. He left no clear successor. His empire immediately began to fracture. His generals would spend the next 40 years fighting over the pieces. Alexander had conquered the known world. He could not conquer death. That failure, that fundamental human limitation made vivid by the most successful man who ever lived, became the seed of a legend. Almost immediately after Alexander's death, stories began to accumulate around his memory. Some of these stories were grounded in fact. Alexander really did cut the Gordian knot, really did weep when told there were no more worlds to conquer, really did name a city after his horse. His actual life was dramatic enough, but the stories grew beyond fact. They became myth. The collection that scholars call the Alexander Romance emerged within decades of his death and continued to grow for over 1,000 years. The earliest Greek version probably dates to the 3rd century AD, but it drew on oral traditions that were centuries older. From Greek, the Romance was translated into Latin, Armenian, Syriac, Arabic, Persian, Ethiopic, and eventually into most European languages. By the medieval period, Alexander had become less a historical figure than a mythological one, a template onto which every culture projected its own dreams and fears. He was a Muslim prophet in some traditions, a Christian king in others, a philosophical seeker, a world conqueror, a warning about hubris, an example of glory. Among the many stories attached to him was a quest for immortality. In the Arabic and Persian traditions, which contain some of the richest and most elaborate versions of the Alexander Romance, Alexander learns of the water of life, Abi Hayat in Persian, Ma al-Hayat in Arabic, a spring that grants eternal existence to anyone who drinks from it. The water is said to lie in a place called the Land of Darkness, at the edge of the earth, where no light penetrates. This is not the Mediterranean world Alexander actually conquered. This is a mythological geography, the land where the sun sets, the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond. To reach it, Alexander must travel beyond everything he has conquered, beyond Persia, beyond India, beyond even the places where the sun rises and sets. He must journey to the end of everything. In most versions of the story, Alexander is accompanied on this journey by a wise figure, often identified with Al-Qidr, a mysterious immortal who appears in Islamic tradition and the Quran. Al-Qidr's name means the Green One. He's associated with life, renewal, and hidden knowledge. In some tellings, he is Alexander's cook or servant, a humble figure who turns out to possess wisdom greater than the conquerors. In others, he is a spiritual guide, sent to lead Alexander toward and ultimately away from the water of life. The journey takes them through impossible terrain. The land of darkness is exactly what it sounds like, a realm of absolute blackness where they must navigate by touch and instinct. In some versions, Alexander has his men bring with them young mares who have recently foaled. The mares' desperate desire to return to their colts ensures they can find their way back out of the darkness. And then comes the moment that defines the legend. In the most famous version, Alexander's cook is preparing a meal during the journey. He has a salted fish, dried and preserved, dead for days or weeks. He finds a spring in the darkness and begins washing the fish in it. The fish immediately springs back to life. It wriggles out of his hands and swims away into the water. The cook realizes what has happened. He has found the water of life. In some tellings, he drinks from it himself. He becomes immortal, not by seeking immortality, but by accident, in the course of his humble duties. He is the servant, not the king, and the water chooses him. But he fails to tell Alexander in time. In other versions, the cook, identified with Al-Qidr, knows exactly what he has found, but does not tell Alexander. He understands, in a way the conqueror does not, that immortality is not something to be seized through ambition. It must be given, not taken. In every version of the story, Alexander fails. Sometimes the wind pushes him back. Sometimes angels bar his path. Sometimes he simply arrives too late, after the moment has passed and the spring has vanished. In the Persian poet Nizami's telling, Alexander reaches the water but cannot bring himself to drink. He is paralyzed by doubt about whether he truly wants to live forever, separated from everyone he has ever loved. The 12th century Persian poet puts these words in Alexander's mouth. What profit to the king if he lives long, when those he loves have perished from the world? The servant drinks. Alexander does not. The greatest conqueror in history walks away empty-handed. The message embedded in these stories is consistent across cultures and centuries. Immortality is not for kings. No matter how much power you accumulate, no matter how many battles you win, no matter how vast your empire, you will die like everyone else. The water of life exists. The stories insist. It can be found, but it will not save you. This is not a cruel message. It does not suggest Alexander was unworthy. It acknowledges the fundamental equality of human mortality. The same fate awaits the emperor and the slave, the conqueror and the conquered. Even Alexander couldn't outrun it. There's something almost comforting in this. The legend doesn't deny our longing for immortality. It validates it. The water of life is real. The desire to find it is natural. But the universe, in its deep wisdom, grants eternal life only to those who don't seek it for power. The cook becomes immortal. The conqueror dies at 32. The story took on particular resonance in Islamic tradition. Surah 18 of the Quran, the chapter of the cave, contains several mysterious narratives. One describes a figure many scholars identify with Alexander, Dul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a righteous king who travels to the ends of the earth where the sun rises and sets. Another narrative in the same chapter describes Moses encountering a wise servant of God, later identified in Islamic tradition as Al-Qida. Moses asks to follow him and learn from him. Al-Qida agrees, but warns Moses that he will witness things he doesn't understand and must not question. What follows are 3 incidents where Al-Qida does things that seem wrong or harmful. He damages a boat. He kills a young man. He repairs a wall for free in a city that refused them hospitality. Each time, Moses questions him. Finally, Al-Qida explains, the boat belonged to poor fishermen, and a king was coming to seize all seaworthy vessels. The damage saved their boat. The young man would have grown up to harm his righteous parents. His death was a mercy. The wall concealed a treasure belonging to 2 orphans. If it had collapsed before they came of age, the treasure would have been stolen. The point is clear. Human understanding is limited. What seems like misfortune may be blessing. What seems like failure may be grace. Applied to the Alexander legend, this suggests something profound. Alexander's failure to drink from the water of life isn't a tragedy, it's protection. He doesn't understand why he can't have immortality, just as Moses doesn't understand Al-Qida's actions. But the limitation is wise. This is the fountain of youth as spiritual metaphor. The water exists. It grants eternal life. But the eternal life worth having isn't physical immortality. It's wisdom, righteousness, submission to forces greater than human ambition. Alexander became a legend because he died young at the height of his power. His quest for the water of life became famous because he failed. In failure, the story found its meaning. By the 12th century, European Christianity was in crisis. The Crusades, launched with such confidence in 1095, had produced spectacular early victories: the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, the establishment of Crusader states stretching from Antioch to the Red Sea. For a brief moment, it seemed Latin Christendom might dominate the entire Eastern Mediterranean, but the tide had turned. One by one, the Crusader states were falling under pressure from resurgent Muslim powers. The Kingdom of Jerusalem shrank. The county of Edessa was lost in 1144, prompting the disastrous Second Crusade. By 1187, Saladin would retake Jerusalem itself. European rulers looked desperately for allies, anyone who might help them hold the Holy Land. And in that desperation, they became susceptible to stories of a powerful Christian kingdom somewhere to the east, beyond the Muslim lands that separated Europe from somewhere. The legend of Prester John began with a kernel of possible truth. In 1145, a German bishop named Otto of Freising was attending the papal court when he met a Syrian churchman named Hugh of Jabala. Hugh had come seeking support for the beleaguered Crusader states. Among the stories Hugh told was an intriguing report. Somewhere in the Far East, a Christian king had recently won a great victory over the Persians. This king was a descendant of the Magi, the wise men who had visited the infant Jesus. He was a priest as well as a monarch, hence Prester, from the Latin presbyter, meaning priest or elder. He had tried to come to Jerusalem to aid his fellow Christians, but the Tigris River had blocked his path. Otto recorded this carefully. He was skeptical. He noted that the story might be unreliable, but he preserved it. Modern historians have identified a possible basis for Hugh's report. In 1141, the Karakitan Khanate, a Central Asian confederation led by Buddhists, had defeated the Seljuk Sultan Sanjar at the Battle of Katwan. Some of the Karakitan's subjects practiced Nestorian Christianity, a branch of the faith that had spread along the Silk Road. Word of this defeat could have traveled westward, gaining Christian embellishments along the way. But the actual victory of a Buddhist Khan over a Muslim sultan was far less useful than the legend of a Christian priest king. The legend served European hopes, and then, around 1165, someone decided to make the legend concrete. Copies of a remarkable document began circulating through the courts of Europe. It was addressed to Manuel I Komnenos, the Byzantine emperor, and to other Christian rulers. The sender identified himself grandly: John, priest by the grace of God and the might of our Lord Jesus Christ, King of kings and Lord of lords. Prester John. The letter described his kingdom in extravagant detail. 72 kings paid him tribute. His realm contained no poor people, no thieves, no liars. His palace was made of ebony and precious stones. A mirror mounted on a tower allowed him to see everything happening in every province of his vast domain. Rivers flowed with gold. The land contained creatures unknown to Europe: salamanders that lived in fire, stones that made the wearer invisible, pepper-bearing trees guarded by serpents. And his kingdom contained wonders beyond price. Among them, a fountain of youth. At the foot of Mount Olympus, the letter read, a different Olympus from the Greek one, bubbles a spring which, when tasted 3 times on an empty stomach, causes a man to feel no illness for 30 years. When he has drunk of it, he feels as though he has become 32 years of age, no matter how old he might have been. The letter was a forgery. Modern scholars have analyzed the linguistic patterns, the political references, the theological claims. The document was almost certainly created by a European cleric, possibly German, possibly Italian, sometime between 1160 and 1175. The motivations remain debated. It may have been propaganda to encourage another crusade. Look, a powerful ally awaits us in the East. It may have been a utopian fantasy, a tract on how Christian governance should work, a satirical commentary on church-state relations. Some scholars have suggested it was written as entertainment, a medieval fantasy novel dressed up as correspondence. What matters is that people believed it, or at least they wanted to believe it. The letter survives in nearly 100 medieval manuscript copies. It was translated into multiple languages. It was referenced in diplomatic correspondence, theological debates, and exploratory planning. Copies were made and recopied for 5 centuries. Pope Alexander III apparently believed it enough to send a reply in 1177, a letter to the illustrious and magnificent King of the Indies, most beloved Son in Christ. The messenger never returned, neither did any subsequent envoys, but the legend had taken root. The kingdom of Prester John kept moving. At first, Europeans placed it in India. India being a vague term that covered anywhere east of Persia. The original letter claimed dominion over the 3 Indias, which medieval geography divided variously into Near India, Middle India, and Far India. When the Mongol Empire erupted across Asia in the 13th century, Europeans hopefully wondered if these new conquerors might be Prester John's people. Franciscan missionaries traveled to the Mongol court specifically to make contact. They found an empire with some Nestorian Christian subjects, but no Christian king. The Great Khan was not Prester John. As geographical knowledge improved and no Prester John emerged in Asia, the legend migrated to Africa. Europeans knew that Ethiopia was a Christian kingdom, isolated, mysterious, located somewhere beyond Muslim-controlled Egypt. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had existed since the 4th century, and its rulers traced their lineage to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The country was powerful enough to resist Muslim expansion. It was Christian enough to be an ally. Perhaps Prester John was there. The identification of Prester John with Ethiopia produced one of history's stranger diplomatic misunderstandings. In 1306, Ethiopian ambassadors arrived at the papal court in Avignon. Europeans were fascinated and confused. They kept trying to ask about Prester John. The Ethiopians had no idea what they were talking about. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had its own traditions, its own liturgy, its own theological disputes with both Rome and Constantinople. But none of those traditions involved a king named John or a fountain that restored youth. The disconnect didn't stop the search. Portuguese explorers spent decades sailing down the African coast, looking for a way to reach Prester John by sea. The motivations were mixed. Gold, spices, and strategic alliance all played roles, but the legend provided a frame for the project. Vasco da Gama's famous 1498 voyage to India was partly motivated by the hope of making contact with the legendary king. When Portuguese envoys finally reached the Ethiopian court in 1520, they insisted on calling the emperor Prester John. Emperor Lebna Dengel was annoyed. He had never heard the name. He had no idea why these foreigners thought he should answer to it. He was the king of kings of Ethiopia, ruler of a Christian empire that had existed for over a millennium. He wasn't a character from a European forgery, but by then, the Fountain of Youth had become standard equipment in Prester John's mythical kingdom. Maps of the period sometimes labeled it explicitly, a small spring or pool located somewhere in the African interior where the old became young again. The visual iconography stabilized. Medieval and Renaissance artists depicted the fountain as a grand pool or bath, often hexagonal or octagonal, set in a beautiful garden. The old entered from one side, hunched, withered, carried by attendants or pushed in wheelbarrows. They emerged from the other side, young and beautiful, ready to feast and dance in the paradise garden surrounding the spring. Lucas Cranach, the elder's 1546 painting, is the most famous version. It shows decrepit crones entering the pool on the left. They swim or bathe through the center. They emerge as beautiful young women on the right, where elegant couples dance and feast in a courtly setting. These images weren't meant as historical documentation. They were allegories, meditations on time and mortality, fantasies of renewal. The Fountain of Youth had become a symbol of human longing, of the paradise we imagine but cannot reach. But symbols can move people to action. And by the early 16th century, European explorers had discovered something that seemed to fit the legends perfectly. A new world across the Western Ocean, filled with wonders they had never imagined. If Prester John's kingdom existed anywhere, surely it was there. When Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, he believed he had found the edges of Asia, the outer reaches of the lands described by Marco Polo, and perhaps the approaches to the Great Khan's realm, or Prester John's. He was wrong about the geography, but he was right that he had found something extraordinary, a new world with millions of inhabitants, complex civilizations, and resources beyond anything Europeans had imagined. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, the Taíno, the Arawak, the Lucayan, and others, possess their own rich traditions, their own cosmologies, their own stories about extraordinary places. And the Spanish, hungry for gold and glory and confirmation of their medieval fantasies, listened eagerly. The Taíno were the dominant people of the Greater Antilles, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica. They were skilled farmers who cultivated cassava, maize, and tobacco. They were accomplished seafarers who traveled between islands in large canoes. They had complex political structures, with chiefs, caciques, ruling territories that could include thousands of people. They also had stories about places beyond their immediate world. The Taíno spoke of a land called Bimini. The word appears in Spanish colonial documents in various spellings: Bimini, Benini, Bimini. Its exact meaning is unclear. Modern scholars have proposed various interpretations. It may have referred to the Bahamas, the chain of islands to the north of Cuba. It may have referred to the Yucatan Peninsula, the land of the Maya, with whom the Taíno had some contact. It may have been a general term for the north, the direction from which cold winds came. What the Spanish thought they heard was this: somewhere north of Cuba, there was an island of great wealth. And on that island, or perhaps on a larger landmass beyond it, there were healing waters. We need to be careful here, because this is where colonial misunderstanding compounds itself. The Spanish were not neutral observers. They were conquerors, slavers, and gold seekers. They had arrived in the Caribbean with expectations shaped by 1,000 years of European legend. Prester John, the fountain of youth, the geography of the Alexander romance. When indigenous people described their world, the Spanish filtered those descriptions through their own cultural framework. They heard what they expected to hear. A story about a spring with medicinal properties became a fountain of youth. A story about a prosperous island became a land of gold. A story about a chief who sailed north became proof that someone was searching for eternal life. Spanish sources record a tantalizing story. A Taíno chief named Sequain gathered a group of followers and sailed north toward Bimini. He never returned. Did this happen? Possibly. The Taíno were accomplished seafarers who regularly traveled between islands. A chief leading an expedition to a northern island, for trade, for exploration, for any number of reasons, would not have been unusual. Did he go searching for a fountain of youth? That's a Spanish interpretation, not necessarily a Taíno one. The Taíno did have beliefs about healing waters. Like many cultures, they valued natural springs and rivers for their spiritual and medicinal properties. But these beliefs were embedded in a complex cosmology that the Spanish barely understood and certainly didn't record accurately. The distinction matters because it reveals how the fountain of youth legend works. The legend doesn't require a real fountain. It requires human imagination, human hope, and human willingness to interpret ambiguous information in the most magical possible way. The Spanish had all three in abundance. The geographical confusion was immense. Europeans in 1500 had no accurate maps of the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico. They didn't know whether Cuba was an island or part of a continent. They didn't know Florida existed. They didn't know how far the American landmass extended. They thought they might be a few weeks' sail from Japan or China. Into this confusion, the Fountain of Youth legend inserted itself. If the Taíno spoke of healing waters to the north, then surely those waters existed. If Bimini was a real place with real wealth, then surely it could be found. If Prester John's kingdom had a fountain of youth, and if this new world might be part of Prester John's realm, then perhaps the fountain was here, just beyond the horizon, just beyond the next island. There's another possibility that some modern scholars have raised. The Spanish may have misheard or mistranslated indigenous references to something completely different. Florida contains natural springs, over 700 of them, including some of the largest in the world. These springs have constant temperatures year-round. Some have significant mineral content. They were almost certainly known to indigenous peoples and probably held spiritual significance. Additionally, the Caribbean contained plants with medicinal properties. One theory suggests the Spanish may have confused the word vid, vine, with vida, life, transforming a story about a healing plant into a fountain of youth legend. But whether the origin was hot springs, medicinal plants, or pure European projection, the result was the same. By the early 16th century, Spanish explorers believed that somewhere in the uncharted regions north of Cuba, there was water that could restore youth. One of them, the man who would become forever associated with this legend, was about to sail into history. Juan Ponce de León was born around 1474 in Santa Vaz de Campos, in the Kingdom of León, in what is now northern Spain. His family was minor nobility, respectable enough to have a coat of arms, not wealthy enough to have significant lands. As a young man, he served as a page in the household of Pedro Núñez de Guzmán, a powerful lord who was also tutor to the future King Ferdinand. This connection would prove useful throughout Ponce de León's career. He learned the skills expected of a young nobleman: literacy, horsemanship, swordsmanship, the complex etiquette of Spanish courts. When he came of age, he fought in the final campaigns of the Reconquista, the centuries-long war to drive Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula. Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, fell in January 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west. With the Reconquista complete, Ponce de León found himself without employment. Spain was full of soldiers who had trained their whole lives for a war that was suddenly over. The New World offered them somewhere to direct their skills. In 1493, Ponce de León sailed with Columbus's second expedition to the Caribbean. Unlike the first voyage, a small fleet of 3 ships that bumped into the Bahamas and Hispaniola. This was a colonizing force. 17 ships, 17 over 1,000 men, horses, livestock, seeds, and tools for permanent settlement. Ponce de León spent the next 15 years climbing the colonial hierarchy. He distinguished himself as a soldier during the conquest of Hispaniola, helping to suppress indigenous resistance with the brutal efficiency that characterized Spanish colonization. He was rewarded with land grants and encomiendas, the system that gave Spanish settlers the right to indigenous labor. By 1508, he had heard rumors of gold on the island of Borinquen, east of Hispaniola. The island would later be called Puerto Rico. With permission from the governor of Hispaniola, Ponce de León led an expedition to explore and, if the rumors were true, conquer. The conquest of Puerto Rico followed the familiar, terrible pattern of Spanish colonization. Ponce de León made initial contact with the Taíno chief Aguebana, who believed cooperation with the Spanish might protect his people. It didn't. The Spanish established settlements, found gold, and began extracting it using indigenous forced labor. When the Taíno revolted in 1511, Ponce de León led the suppression. The rebellion was crushed. Thousands of Taíno died from violence, disease, and the brutal conditions of the gold mines. Within decades, the indigenous population of Puerto Rico would be effectively extinct. Ponce de León, meanwhile, became one of the wealthiest men in the Caribbean. He was appointed governor of Puerto Rico in 1509. He had a large estate, extensive mining operations, and political influence. Then Diego Columbus arrived. Diego Columbus was Christopher Columbus's son. He had spent years fighting in Spanish courts to establish his rights as heir to his father's titles and privileges. Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of the Indies. In 1509, the courts ruled in his favor. Diego arrived in the Caribbean as the new governor of the Indies, determined to consolidate power over the entire Spanish colonial enterprise. Ponce de León was in his way. The details of the conflict are complex, involving disputed grants, overlapping jurisdictions, the question of whether Puerto Rico fell under Diego's authority or had been separately granted to Ponce de León. But the result was clear. By 1511, Ponce de León had lost the governorship of Puerto Rico. Diego Columbus's allies controlled the colonial administration. Ponce de León was still wealthy, still powerful, but he needed a new project, something that would re-establish his position, preferably in a territory outside Diego's reach. He looked north. In 1512, Ponce de León traveled to Spain and obtained a contract from King Ferdinand, authorizing him to explore and settle the island of Bimini. This document survives. It has been examined by historians repeatedly over the past century. Here is what it says. The contract authorizes Ponce de León to discover, conquer, and settle Bimini. It specifies terms for distributing any gold found. 1/10 to the crown, the rest divided among participants according to their investment and service. It establishes rules for treating indigenous peoples, the standard Spanish legal framework for subjugation and enslavement. It grants Ponce de León the title of adelantado, governor and military commander, of any lands he claims. Here is what the contract does not say. It does not mention a fountain. It does not mention youth. It does not mention healing waters, immortality, or any kind of miraculous spring. Not once, not anywhere in the document. The same is true of the follow-up contract issued after Ponce de León's return. Gold, land, Indians, governance. These are the subjects covered. The Fountain of Youth is not mentioned. In March 1513, Ponce de León sailed from Puerto Rico with 3 ships and approximately 200 men. He traveled northwest through the Bahamas, touching various islands that Spanish ships had visited before. On April 2nd, 1513, Easter Sunday, or close to it, he sighted a coastline that he initially believed was another large island. He made landfall somewhere along the Atlantic coast, probably between present-day St. Augustine and Melbourne. He named it La Florida. The name has multiple possible origins. Pascua Florida is the Spanish name for Easter, the Feast of Flowers. Florida was also famously lush. covered with flowering plants unlike anything in the Caribbean. The name fit either way. Over the following weeks, Ponce de León explored Florida's Atlantic coast, rounded the Florida Keys, and sailed partway up the Gulf Coast. His ships fought against a powerful current that pushed them backward even when the wind was favorable. The first European encounter with the Gulf Stream, the massive ocean current that would later make Florida the gateway to the Atlantic for Spanish treasure fleets. He encountered indigenous peoples, some friendly, some hostile. The Calusa of southwestern Florida attacked his ships. Other groups traded cautiously. Ponce de León made maps, took notes, claimed the territory for Spain. Then he sailed home to Puerto Rico. Ponce de León's surviving letters discuss his discovery in practical terms. He wanted to establish whether Florida was an island or a peninsula, a geographical question that remained unanswered until later expeditions. He wanted to find gold, though he found no evidence of significant deposits. He wanted to establish a colony that he would govern, outside Diego Columbus's authority. The letters do not mention a fountain. They do not mention the search for youth. They do not mention any magical water of any kind. Neither does any other document written during Ponce de León's lifetime. Not his contracts, not his letters, not the reports of his officers, not the testimony of his crew. The Fountain of Youth does not appear anywhere. In 1521, Ponce de León returned to Florida with a larger expedition. 200 colonists, including farmers, craftsmen, and priests. This was to be a permanent settlement, the foundation of Spanish Florida. It lasted less than a month. The Calusa people of southwestern Florida attacked the Spanish settlers almost immediately. They were skilled warriors who had resisted Spanish encroachment for years. The fighting was fierce, sustained, and ultimately decisive. During one engagement, Ponce de León was struck in the thigh by an arrow. The wound was severe. The arrow may have been poisoned. The Calusa used plant toxins on their weapons. Unable to continue, Ponce de León ordered a retreat to Cuba. He died in Havana in July 1521. He was approximately 47 years old, though, like many details of his early life, the exact date of his birth is uncertain. He had found Florida. He had discovered the Gulf Stream. He had failed to establish a colony. He had never written a single word about any fountain of youth. So where did the story come from? 14 years after Ponce de León's death, a Spanish court chronicler named Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés published the first major history of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Oviedo was a career bureaucrat and courtier. He had served in various positions in the Indies, including superintendent of gold smelting, a position that gave him access to wealth and political connections. He was a careful observer of the natural world, producing detailed descriptions of Caribbean plants and animals. He was also a political operator who had spent decades navigating the dangerous waters of the Spanish court. He had allies and enemies. He had debts to repay and grudges to settle. Among his allies, Diego Columbus and his faction, who had displaced Ponce de León from Puerto Rico. Among his enemies, the memory of Juan Ponce de León. In his Historia General y Natural de las Indias, published in 1535, Oviedo included a remarkable claim. Ponce de León, he wrote, had sailed to Florida searching for a fountain that would cure the weakness of old age. The Indians had fooled him into believing such a fountain existed. He had spent his final voyage chasing a fantasy. Oviedo went further. He suggested that Ponce de León's motivation was specifically to cure his sexual impotence, a claim designed to humiliate and emasculate. Here is what Oviedo wrote. It is said that there was found among these islands the fountain of youth, and especially on the island of Bimini, which many foolish people believed. Juan Ponce de León, deceived by a tale of the Indians, and believing he would find the fountain, went to search for it on the island of Florida. This was an insult wrapped in a legend. In 16th century Spain, believing in magical water was considered foolish, the kind of thing ignorant peasants might do, not educated conquistadors. Magic and superstition were associated with the lower classes, with indigenous peoples, with the credulous and uneducated. To say that Ponce de León had searched for the fountain of youth was to call him a fool. And impotence was a subject of mockery and shame. A man who couldn't perform sexually was considered less than a man. By suggesting Ponce de León had sought the fountain to cure his impotence, Oviedo was attacking not just his intelligence but his masculinity. This wasn't history. This was character assassination. Why would Oviedo do this? The answer lies in colonial politics. Ponce de León had been Diego Columbus's rival. Their conflict over the governorship of Puerto Rico had been bitter and public. Even after Ponce de León's death, his heirs continued legal battles over his titles and estates. The Columbus faction had every interest in tarnishing his reputation. Oviedo, who had aligned himself with the Columbus family, delivered. The Fountain of Youth story was perfect for the purpose. It acknowledged that Ponce de León had discovered Florida. That geographical fact couldn't be denied, but it reframed the discovery as an accident. He hadn't been a visionary explorer seeking new territories for Spain. He'd been a credulous old man chasing fairy tales. Any success he achieved was despite his foolishness, not because of his skill. The insult was clever enough to stick. The legend might have faded if not for subsequent writers who repeated and embellished it. In 1575, Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda published a memoir about Florida. Fontaneda had a remarkable story of his own. He had been shipwrecked there as a boy of 13 and lived among indigenous peoples for 17 years before finally being ransomed by the Spanish. He knew more about Florida's native cultures than almost any European alive. In his memoir, Fontaneda mentioned the Fountain of Youth legend. He said indigenous people spoke of a river Jordan with healing properties somewhere in the interior. He said Ponce de León might have heard these stories from the Indians, but, and this is crucial, Fontaneda explicitly expressed skepticism. "I state this," he wrote, "only because I have heard others say so, but I do not believe it. As for the fountain that Ponce de León went to seek in Florida, it is a mockery to say he went in search of it, for it is certain he went in quest of gold and to take Indians as slaves." Fontaneda knew the difference between legend and reality. He'd spent 17 years in Florida. He understood that indigenous stories about healing waters were not the same as European fantasies about fountains of youth. Later writers ignored his skepticism. They took his mention of the legend as confirmation that it was true. The man who cemented the myth was Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas. Herrera was Spain's Cronista Mayor de las Indias, chief chronicler of the Indies, the official royal historian responsible for writing the authoritative account of Spanish colonization. His position gave him access to royal archives and colonial records. It also gave him the imprimatur of the crown. In 1601, Herrera published his comprehensive Historia General de los Hechos de los Castellanos, General History of the Deeds of the Castilians. His account of Ponce de León's voyage was more detailed than any previous version and more romantic. He described the fountain legend at length. The local caciques paid regular visits to the fountain. A frail old man could become so completely restored that he could resume all manly exercises, take a new wife, and beget more children. He claimed the Spanish had searched every river, brook, lagoon, or pool along the Florida coast, looking for the legendary water. This was pure fiction. No records support any such systematic search, but Herrera was the official historian. His work was authoritative. His books were translated, reprinted, and cited as definitive sources for centuries. Anyone writing about Ponce de León after 1601 would cite Herrera, and Herrera's version included the Fountain of Youth as established fact. Let's be clear about what happened here. Oviedo invented a smear in 1535, calling Ponce de León a fool who chased fairy tales. Fontaneda mentioned the legend in 1575 while explicitly expressing doubt. Herrera romanticized everything in 1601 and presented it as fact. None of them were reporting what Ponce de León actually did. They were creating a story that served their own purposes, political, literary, commercial, and the story was too good to die. The great conquistador, terrified of aging, sailing to the New World in search of magical water. That's a narrative with power. It has irony, it has tragedy, it has human vulnerability. It transforms a brutal colonizer into something almost sympathetic, a man driven by the same fear of death that haunts all of us. The true story, a political exile looking for land, gold, and a second chance at power, is much less compelling. So the myth endured and the truth faded, until eventually almost everyone forgot that the Fountain of Youth was an insult, not a legend. By the late 19th century, St. Augustine had reinvented itself. Once a Spanish colonial outpost, then a British possession, then briefly Spanish again, then part of the American South, the city had fallen into genteel decay after the Civil War. Its Spanish architecture was crumbling. Its economy was stagnant. The wealthy had fled north. The poor remained. Then, Henry Flagler arrived. Flagler was John D. Rockefeller's partner in Standard Oil, one of the wealthiest men in America. He had made his fortune in petroleum and spent his later years transforming Florida. He built the Florida East Coast Railway, opening the state to northern tourists. He constructed grand hotels, the Ponce de León, the Alcazar, the Casa Monica, that turned St. Augustine into a destination for the Gilded Age elite. Where there are tourists, there are people willing to sell them something. And what better to sell than a legend? The property that would become the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park was purchased in the 1870s by Henry H. Williams, a British horticulturist. Williams knew the area's Spanish history. He understood the commercial potential of linking his property to the Ponce de León legend. In 1875, Williams hired two local men, Philip Gomez and Philip Capo, to dig a well on his property. They found water, as expected in an area with a high water table. The water was mineral rich. with a noticeable sulfur smell. Williams began showing the well to visitors, suggesting it might be connected to the Ponce de León legend. Tourists came. They drank the peculiar water. They bought postcards showing the Fountain of Youth. But Williams never fully developed the attraction. He was a cautious man, a horticulturist more interested in plants than promotion. The Fountain of Youth required someone with more imagination and fewer scruples. Enter Diamond Lil. Luella Day McConnell was born around 1870, though like everything else about her, the date shifted depending on who was asking. She came from Baltimore. She moved to Indiana and then Chicago, where she became a practicing physician at a time when female doctors were rare and faced constant skepticism. She was apparently successful enough, or at least notorious enough, to attract attention. Newspaper accounts mention her involvement with something called Edison's obesity pills and her membership in the Women's Civic Reform Society. She was not a woman content to fade into the background. Somewhere along the way, she acquired a nickname, Diamond Lil. The origin of the name varied with the telling. One story claimed she had a diamond embedded in her front tooth, a literally flashy accessory that announced her presence. Another said she earned the name during the Klondike Gold Rush, where she allegedly made a fortune in the Yukon. What's certain is that in 1898, like thousands of others, she caught gold fever. She abandoned her medical practice and headed north. The Klondike was brutal. Getting there required crossing hundreds of miles of Canadian wilderness, often by foot, hauling supplies over mountain passes. Most gold seekers found nothing. Many died. Those who survived faced a lawless frontier town where fortunes were made and lost overnight. McConnell arrived in Dawson City and apparently did well enough. She married a man named Ed McConnell, her second husband. A first marriage had already ended somewhere along the way. She operated the Melbourne Hotel. She may have continued practicing medicine, though Canadian authorities disputed her credentials. She was outspoken about graft and corruption in the territorial government, which made her enemies. Officials passed laws that limited her ability to practice medicine. She claimed, truthfully or not, that powerful men tried to have her killed. By 1904, she'd had enough of the Yukon. She headed south, looking for new opportunities. She found St. Augustine. McConnell arrived in St. Augustine with cash and diamonds, literally. She used them to purchase the Williams property outright, reportedly paying in part with the jewels that had earned her nickname. St. Augustine at the time was firmly in the grip of Ponce de León mania. Flagler had named his flagship hotel after the explorer. Statues and monuments commemorated the Spanish colonial period. The Fountain of Youth legend was widely known, even if its actual location was disputed. McConnell saw her opportunity. She understood something fundamental about the Fountain of Youth. People didn't really believe the water would make them young. They wanted to participate in a story. They wanted to touch something ancient, to feel connected to a legend they'd heard since childhood. She gave them that experience. McConnell began advertising the attraction aggressively. She charged admission, unusual for the time, when many attractions were free. She sold postcards and souvenirs. She bottled the well water and sold it by the glass or by the jug. She dressed in elaborate costumes and told dramatic stories about Spanish explorers, indigenous magic, and the eternal human quest for youth. She was a performer as much as a businesswoman, turning every visitor's experience into theater, and she fabricated evidence. Shortly after acquiring the property, McConnell announced a remarkable discovery. She had found a stone cross on the grounds, 15 stones long, 13 stones wide, made of coquina, the local shell rock. She claimed it had been placed there by Ponce de León himself to mark the fountain's location. This was not entirely invented from nothing. A worker named B.A. Pachetti had actually unearthed a cross years earlier during Williams's tenure, but Williams had been told that coquina wasn't available on the Florida mainland in 1513. The Spanish had quarried it from Anastasia Island across the bay, so he had the cross reburied and forgotten. McConnell had no such hesitation. She rediscovered the cross with great fanfare. She also announced the discovery of a silver casket supposedly containing worn documents from Ponce de León's era. The documents were too deteriorated to read, she said. The casket's origins couldn't be verified. The whole thing was almost certainly fabricated. It didn't matter. Visitors came by the thousands. McConnell's claims grew more elaborate over time. She said she was descended from the Bonaparte family and owned Napoleon's pocket watch. She said the Chinese had built the Spanish fort in St. Augustine, the Castillo de San Marcos, actually constructed by the Spanish in the 1670s using Timucua forced labor. She said people had tried to poison her with gas, Coca-Cola, apples, and a watermelon. She wrote letters to President Taft, warning that powerful men in Washington were plotting to murder women. She was rumored to have hosted illegal gambling parties on her property. A neighbor accused her of shooting his horse when it wandered onto her land. During World War I, she was briefly jailed on suspicion of being a German spy, an accusation that appears to have been without merit, but reflects how much she annoyed the local authorities. St. Augustine's respectable citizens were appalled. The St. Augustine Historical Society considered her an embarrassment, a charlatan who was cheapening the city's legitimate Spanish heritage with her fabrications. The tourists kept coming anyway. McConnell understood her audience better than her critics did. People didn't come to the Fountain of Youth for rigorous historical accuracy. They came for wonder. They came for stories. They came to drink strange-tasting water and imagine, just for a moment, that the world contained magic. She gave them exactly that. On June 23, 1927, Luella Day McConnell drove her car into a ditch on the outskirts of St. Augustine. She died from her injuries. She was either 57 or 67 years old, depending on which of her own accounts you believed. Rumors circulated that she had buried treasure somewhere on the Fountain of Youth property. She had, after all, arrived with diamonds and made a career of finding valuable things in the ground. No treasure was ever found. An ex-husband, not Ed McConnell, who had stayed in the Yukon, came to claim her body. No one seems to know what he did with it. Her final resting place remains a mystery. She had spent 23 years turning a dubious legend into a profitable business. She had embellished, fabricated, and lied without apparent remorse. And in doing so, she had ensured that the Fountain of Youth would remain part of American culture for at least another century. Walter B. Fraser, a Georgia businessman who had managed the attraction for McConnell, bought the property after her death for $100,000, a substantial sum in 1927. Fraser ran the Fountain of Youth with less flamboyance but equal commercial success. He understood that the attraction could be both entertaining and educational. In 1934, he invited the Smithsonian Institution to conduct archaeological excavations. The archaeologists found significant historical artifacts, but not the kind McConnell had imagined. They discovered Timucua burial grounds, evidence of the indigenous people who had lived in the area for thousands of years before European contact. The burials showed signs of Christian conversion, crosses, rosaries, indicating these were natives, who had been evangelized by Spanish missionaries in the 16th and 17th centuries. They found traces of the Misión Nombre de Dios, established by Spanish friars in 1587, possibly the oldest Christian mission in what is now the United States. They found evidence that the property was part of Pedro Menéndez de Aviles's 1565 settlement, the original Saint Augustine. Real history, buried under the false legend. Today, the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park operates as both a tourist attraction and a legitimate historical site. Visitors can explore genuine archaeological discoveries. They can learn about Timucua culture, Spanish colonization, and the complex history of European indigenous contact in Florida. Professional archaeologists continue to excavate the site, overseen by institutions including the University of Florida. They can also drink from the well that was dug in 1875 and buy bottled Fountain of Youth water from the gift shop. The water still tastes of sulfur, mineral-rich, sharp on the tongue. No one has been documented becoming younger after drinking it. In 2000, the state of Florida erected a plaque honoring Luella Day McConnell as a great Floridian. It notes that she fabricated stories to amuse and appall the city's residents. It does not mention whether she ever drank from her own fountain. 2.5 millennia. That's how long humans have been telling stories about water that restores youth. From Herodotus's Macrobians to the Silicon Valley billionaires funding longevity research today, the quest hasn't stopped. The details change. Mineral springs become cellular reprogramming. Magical fountains become pharmaceutical interventions. But the underlying impulse remains identical. We do not want to die. We especially do not want to grow old. Aging strips away our capabilities, our beauty, our independence. It forces us to confront the gradual diminishment of everything we are. Death, at least, is a single moment. Aging is years or decades of loss. So we dream of water that undoes time. Water makes intuitive sense as a vehicle for this fantasy. Water sustains life. Without it, we die within days. Our bodies are mostly water. We emerged as a species from water, the oceans where life began. We emerge as individuals from water, the amniotic fluid of the womb. Every major religion incorporates water into its rituals of transformation. In Christianity, baptism represents spiritual rebirth through immersion. In Hinduism, bathing in the Ganges cleanses sin and eases the soul's passage to the afterlife. In Judaism, the mikveh purifies. In Islam, wudu, ritual washing, precedes prayer. Water marks transitions between states of being, birth, purification, renewal, death. The body given to the sea, scattered as ashes into rivers. If you want to imagine a substance that could reverse the greatest transition of all, from life to death, water is the obvious choice. But notice what every version of the Fountain of Youth legend has in common. The water is never found. Herodotus's Macrobians remain unconquered, their spring unreached. Alexander journeys to the land of darkness, but fails to drink. Prester John's kingdom is always beyond the next mountain range, the next ocean. Ponce de León sails to Florida and comes back empty-handed. Even the stories that promise immortality also promise failure. This isn't a flaw in the legend, it's the point. The fountain of youth doesn't exist because it can't exist. The chemistry and biology of aging are fundamental to how life works. Cells replicate imperfectly. DNA accumulates damage. Telomeres shorten. Proteins misfold. Mitochondria fail. These processes are not bugs in the system. They're features, consequences of the same mechanisms that allow life to exist at all. No water, no substance at all can reverse entropy. But we keep telling the story anyway, because the story isn't really about water. It's about hope. It's about the refusal to accept that everything ends. It's about the human capacity to imagine something better than the fate that awaits us. Today, the wealthiest humans on Earth are funding what amounts to a new Fountain of Youth quest. Jeff Bezos has invested in Altos Labs, a biotechnology company pursuing cellular reprogramming to reverse biological aging. The science is real, based on the Nobel Prize-winning discovery that adult cells can be reset to embryonic states using specific proteins called Yamanaka factors. Whether this can extend human lifespan remains to be seen. Google's founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, back Calico Labs, a company dedicated to understanding and potentially curing aging. They've partnered with pharmaceutical giants and hired some of the world's leading scientists. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has reportedly invested $180 million of his own money in Retro Biosciences, which focuses on plasma-based rejuvenation therapies. Peter Thiel, the billionaire co-founder of PayPal, has funded various anti-aging ventures and publicly stated that he hopes to live forever. The entrepreneur Brian Johnson spends approximately $2 million annually on his Blueprint program, a comprehensive anti-aging regimen involving hundreds of supplements, strict dietary restrictions, constant medical monitoring, and experimental treatments. He believes aging is a problem that can be solved through engineering and optimization. These are serious people with serious resources pursuing what they consider serious science. And maybe they'll succeed. Maybe, in 50 years or 100 years, we'll look back on mortality the way we look back on smallpox, as a terrible affliction that humanity finally conquered. Maybe our great-grandchildren will live for centuries, barely remembering that their ancestors died at 80 and considered it a long life. Or maybe they won't. Maybe aging is too fundamental to life's architecture. Maybe every intervention will have diminishing returns, extending life by years while never eliminating death. Maybe the billionaires of 2125 will still be searching for something that always recedes just out of reach. Newer versions of cellular reprogramming, quantum biology, consciousness uploading, whatever the cutting edge becomes. The quest continues either way, because the impulse behind the quest is as old as humanity itself. Herodotus documented it 2,500 years ago. The Alexander Romance dramatized it. Prester John's forged letter exploited it. Diamond Lil monetized it. The technology changes, the hope doesn't. Let's return to where we began. St. Augustine. A well dug in 1875 by two laborers named Philip. Water that tastes of sulfur. Tourists hoping to touch something ancient. They're not stupid, these visitors. They know they won't become young again. They know the well was dug by workmen for a horticulturist, not discovered by conquistadors. Most of them know Diamond Lil was a con artist who died in a car accident and made up most of her stories. They drink anyway, because the Fountain of Youth offers something that facts can't provide. Participation in a story that's older than Christianity, older than Alexander, older than recorded history. A story about what humans want and what humans fear and what humans imagine when they stare into the darkness of their own mortality. Drinking from the well doesn't make you young, but it connects you to everyone who ever dreamed of youth. From Persian spies in Africa, to medieval crusaders, to Spanish conquistadors, to modern tourists. It makes you part of something bigger than yourself. That's worth the price of admission. We should also acknowledge what the legend cost. The myth of the Fountain of Youth, embedded in the larger mythology of the New World as a place of miracles and riches, helped justify centuries of colonial violence. Indigenous peoples were enslaved, displaced, and killed by Europeans chasing fantasies of gold and eternal life. The Taíno, whose stories Spanish conquistadors misinterpreted, were nearly exterminated within decades of first contact. The Timucua of Florida, whose burial grounds lie beneath the Fountain of Youth Park, were devastated by disease and war. By the early 18th century, they had effectively ceased to exist as a people. Ponce de León himself was a brutal colonizer who built his fortune on enslaved labor. He suppressed indigenous rebellions with violence. He treated human beings as resources to be exploited. Whatever lies were told about him after his death, the truths of his life were grim enough. The Fountain of Youth is not an innocent story. Beautiful myths can have ugly consequences. The dream of eternal life led Europeans across oceans to a new world, and the people they found there paid the price. This is not a contradiction to resolve, but a complexity to hold. The same legend that speaks to universal human hopes also served as justification for particular human horrors. Both things are true. And yet, there's something irreducibly human about dreaming of water that conquers death. Something that transcends any particular culture or century. Something that connects the Persian spies who bathed in a violet-scented spring to the Silicon Valley billionaires funding longevity research, to the tourists who wince at sulfurous water in Florida today. We are the species that knows it will die and refuses to accept it. That refusal creates religions and funds scientific research. It fills gift shops with bottled water and laboratories with gene sequencing equipment. It drives both the noblest and the cruelest aspects of human civilization. The Fountain of Youth doesn't exist. It has never existed. It cannot exist. But the hope that it might, that's as real as anything. What began as a Greek historian's observation about a spring in Africa became an immortal legend. Herodotus planted the seed. Alexander carried it through the Islamic world, where it became intertwined with Persian poetry and Quranic interpretation. Prester John's forged letter spread it across medieval Europe, where it motivated explorers and missionaries for centuries. Taíno whispers, misunderstood, mistranslated, mythologized, gave it a New World location. A smear campaign against a dead conquistador cemented it in history, and a woman with a diamond in her tooth turned it into a tourist attraction. The Fountain of Youth is a lie built on lies. Oviedo's slander, Herrera's romance, McConnell's fabrications, layer upon layer of fiction, each generation embellishing what the last invented, each version claiming to be history while actually being something else. Political attack, romantic fantasy, commercial enterprise. But consider what the lie achieved. It outlived everyone who told it. It crossed oceans and centuries. It attached itself to cultures that had never heard of each other, adapting to new contexts while preserving its essential shape. Water, youth, a place just beyond reach, the same story told 10,000 times. There's a paradox at the heart of the Fountain of Youth legend. The whole point of the story is that eternal life is impossible, that even Alexander, even the greatest king in history, cannot escape death. Every version of the myth ends in failure. Every seeker comes back empty-handed. And yet we keep seeking. We tell a story about the futility of chasing immortality, and then we chase immortality anyway. We know the fountain isn't real, and then we drink from it just in case. Maybe that's what the legend has always been about. Not the water, not the magic, but the hope that refuses to die, even when we know it should. The Fountain of Youth was never a spring. It was a story, and stories, unlike people, can live forever. Thank you for watching. If this video made you think differently about the legends we inherit and the truths we overlook, consider subscribing to the Midnight Archives. We explore the dark, forgotten, and misunderstood corners of history, the stories behind the stories you think you know. Until next time.